Human beings have been progressing on this earth since ancient time. Human being has been into research since time immemorial. Due to this, there were various discovery modes. As a result of this, world has become quite accessible. We can say that the world has become a smaller place for us. But desires are unlimited in spite of all the luxury we have. In search of fulfillment of this vicious circle, we leave behind mental peace. Consequently, our heart cries for peace. Our ultimate aim in life is to bring peace, happiness, and satisfaction in our life. To bring this satisfaction and happiness in our life, we have to be quite adjustable. Self-awareness is necessary for well-adjustment. Self-awareness is closely concerned with self-concept. The concept of self, its development and related terms such as ego and character, from perhaps the most controversial area of current psychological theory and research. Self-concept helps everybody to grow properly and adjust properly. Positive self-concept always strengthens the ability of reasoning, problem solving, and efficiency of a child. High self-esteem leads a person towards great success. What is self-concept? Self-concept is an important term for both social psychology and humanism. The term self-concept is a general term used to refer to how someone thinks about or perceives themselves. The self-concept is how we think about and evaluate ourselves. To be aware of oneself is to have a concept of oneself. Baumeister provides the following self-concept definition. The individual's belief about himself or herself, including the person's attributes and who and what the self is. Lewis suggests that development of a concept of self has two aspects. The existential self. This is the most basic part of the self-scheme or self-concept. The sense of being separate and distinct from others and the awareness of the constancy of the self. The child realizes that they exist as a separate entity from others and that they continue to exist over time and space. According to Lewis, awareness of the existential self begins as young as 2 to 3 months old and arises in part due to the relation the child has with the world. For example, the child smiles and someone smiles back, or the child touches a mobile and sees it move. The categorical self. Having realized that he or she exists as a separate experiencing being, the child next becomes aware that he or she is also an object in the world. Just as other objects, including people, have properties that can be experienced. So the child is becoming aware of him or herself as an object which can be experienced and which has properties. The self too can be put into categories such as age, gender, size, or skill. Two of the first categories to be applied are age and gender. In early childhood, the categories children apply to themselves are very concrete. Later, self-description also begins to include reference to internal psychological traits, comparative evaluations, and to how others see them. The term self-concept is a general term used to refer to how someone thinks about or perceives themselves. The self-concept is how we think about and evaluate ourselves. To be aware of oneself is to have a concept of oneself. Baumeister provides the following self-concept definition. The individual's belief about himself or herself, including the person's attributes and who and what the self is. Carl Rogers believes that the self-concept has three different components. The view you have of yourself or self-image. How much value you place on yourself or self-esteem or self-worth. What you wish you were really like or ideal self. Self-image or what you see in yourself. This does not necessarily have to reflect reality. Indeed, a person with anorexia who is thin may have a self-image in which the person believes they are fat. A person's self-image is affected by many factors, such as parental influences, friends, the media, etc. Kuhn investigated the self-image by using the 20 statements test. He asked people to answer the question, "Who am I?" in 20 different ways. He found that the responses could be divided into two major groups. These were social rules, external or objective aspects of oneself such as son, teacher, friend, and personality traits, internal or affective aspects of oneself such as gregarious, impatient, hubris. The list of answers to the question, "Who am I?" probably include examples of each of the following four types of responses. Physical description: I am tall, have blue eyes, etc. Social roles: we are all social beings whose behavior is shaped to some extent by the roles we play. Such roles as student, housewife, or member of the football team not only help others to recognize us, but also help us to know what is expected of us in various situations. Personal traits. These are a third dimension of our self-descriptions. I am impulsive. I am generous. I tend to worry a lot, etc. Existential statements, abstract ones. These can range from "I am a child of the universe" to "I am a human being" to "I am a spiritual being," etc. Typically, young people describe themselves more in terms of such personal traits, whereas older people feel defined to a greater extent by their social roles. The development of self. The most important result of the socialization process is the development of self. It has already been seen how person perception arises in the second half of the first year. The infant is able to perceive other persons and gradually learns to differentiate the familiar persons from the unfamiliar persons towards the end of the first year. The next step in the process is the perception of the self. However, this is one of the most difficult achievements of man. It is well known that the most complex Indian thought is to be found in the Upanishads, which were composed more than 3,000 years ago, and that the central problem discussed in them is the problem of the self. Our present interest now is not in the problem of the self, but how the concept of self arises in the child and how the self concept affects social behavior. During the second year, with the acquisition of language, the child learns to use the personal pronouns. Even the 2-year-old child is not able to use the pronouns correctly. Once he learns the correct use of the pronouns I and me, he uses them constantly. Self-reference becomes the dominant feature of his language in the 3rd year. Thus, the child learns to look upon himself as an object to himself. Because of the use of language and because of his superior intelligence, man has the ability to think of his body, his behavior, his appearance to other persons. He is aware of his feelings and his self. It is convenient to think of a person's attitude towards himself as having 3 aspects: the cognitive, the affective, and the behavior. The cognitive component represents his thoughts about himself, what he is, who he is, what his ambitions are, what his physical appearance is, etc. The affective component represents his feelings towards himself, the feeling of self-worth, etc. The behavioral component is the tendency to act toward oneself in various ways. He may condemn himself, he may oversensitive to some of his characteristics, etc. The child not only responds to the objects and persons in his environment, but also to his own body, his own feelings, and his own thoughts. In so doing, he develops cognitions about the self. Gradually, the self becomes the nucleus around which the many diverse wants and goals of the individual become organized. The self also becomes the central and valued object. Thus, the self-concept becomes the source of motivation. Psychological dimension of self-concept. Self-concept, like so many other aspects of personality, arises out of the interaction of the individual with others. The self is a product of social interaction. As Mead, 1934, pointed out, the self arises in conduct when the individual becomes a social object in experience to himself. This takes place when the individual assumes the attitude or uses the gesture which another individual would use and responds to it himself or tends to so respond. The child gradually becomes a social being in his own experience, and he acts towards himself in a manner analogous to that in which he acts toward others. Gradually, he learns to conceive of himself as having characteristics which are perceived by others. Because others say that he is a good boy or bright boy, he looks upon himself as such. He incorporates into himself all these characteristics. By giving the child a name, by making him respond to the name, by making him repeat the name in response to such questions as, "Who are you?" the parents and others make him recognize his name and build up in him a sense of identity. As the child matures and has more and more experiences, he begins to organize his perceptions into a fluid but consistent and recognizable pattern, which was called the self-structure by Carl Ransom Rogers, who was an influential American psychologist and among the founders of the humanistic approach or client-centered approach to psychology. The individual's way of looking at himself becomes the self-concept. It is for the most part consistent with the individual's general mode of thinking, feeling, and acting. Snigg and Combs in 1959 stated that the basic human need is to preserve and enhance the self that we perceive and believe in. In other words, all our behavior, including our thoughts, attitudes, values, and feelings, is directed toward keeping ourselves intact and functioning in accordance with our expectations of what adequate functioning is or should be. The self-concept also includes the expectations of others about the individual. Just as a child learns that others are important to him to satisfy his needs, he also learns that he is important to others. He also becomes acquisitive. He wants things for himself. He grabs at things which belong to others and clings to them and resists attempts of the other children to take them away from his grasp. As he grows, he learns that he can explore the physical environment and gradually learns the difference between self and not self. During the third year, the child increasingly finds himself or herself in conflict with the standards of his parents as his explorations become more vigorous, and in a middle-class home, the child starts pulling books from the shelves and other articles in the room. He or she may also annoy his parents by urinating in inappropriate places. Gradually, there is a check over the child's impulsive and spontaneous behavior, which comes into conflict with the possessions of the parents and their other standards. Sooner or later, the child is punished for these acts. This leads him to the next step in his development, namely to incorporate into his self-structure and self-concept the parental expectations and thus accepting restrictions. Thus, at this stage, there is a lot of negativism in the child since he or she has to change her self-concept. In the past, a child's relationship with the parents had been characterized by cuddling and caressing and soft words. As the child grows, he or she finds that the parents speak loudly and with anger, and they may slap him. He finds himself rejected by the parents. The only way of gaining their love again is to internalize their restrictions and to change his self-concept to include the new standards of the parents. The child now learns to accept the limits placed by his or her parents not only when they are present but also when they are not present. A further step in his or her development is to feel guilty when he or she does something bad or wrong. He may react to this by punishing himself. He may say, "I'm a bad boy," and he may slap his own hands. Thus, he does to himself what his parents would do to him under those circumstances when he has transgressed or violated their parents' rules. This restraining and punishing aspect of his self-structure is conscience. Fred called it the superego. Essentially, conscience is a pattern or way of reacting to ourselves. The conscience itself now becomes a socializing agent in preventing misbehavior. It is possible that the child learns to develop and react to such internal controls more easily when he is brought up by verbal control by his parents, and where loss of love rather than physical punishment becomes the chief strategy by which the parents deal with the child's misbehavior. In other words, it is possible that where physical punishment is the main method of control used by the parents, the child finds it difficult to develop these internal restraints and depends more on external rather than on internal controls. This is why often the employers who have to deal with the illiterate and unskilled labor have to use scolding and actual physical punishments or threats of physical punishments to make them do their legitimate work. Bandura and MacDonald found that the behavior of the models had a greater influence on the behavior of children than the amount of reinforcement which the children received. This finding throws a light on the development of conscience during the early years of childhood. It is likely that the parents who make a great use of physical punishment are themselves unable to depend on inner controls. Hence, their lack of confidence in their children's ability to develop and use such controls. Many studies have shown that lower class parents are more likely to make use of physical punishment in child control than are middle class parents. In later childhood years, that is, after 6 years of age, the child comes into contact with the peer groups and with new sets of standards. He incorporates these standards into his self-structure in the same way he incorporated the parental standards earlier. Thus, the growth of self depends on continual learning, unlearning, and relearning. It involves adjustments and readjustments. These changes are difficult for any person. This is why in later childhood years and during adolescence, every individual needs emotional support and understanding from others. Thus, conformity, conscience, superego, and guilt feelings all result in the attempt of growing individual to meet the needs concerned with belongingness, to maintain satisfactory relations with other persons, first at home, later outside the home. In essence, the problem of every individual is to learn the best ways of satisfying his basic needs without trespassing on the rights of other people and in conformity with his own ideas. With the establishment of necessary controls over his own impulses, an individual is able to obtain acceptance as a participating member of the society. As he becomes more competent and effective, the later development of the self is related to higher needs, as Maslow has shown, namely the needs connected with achievement and self-expression. In other words, to become a self-reliant and productive person. Finally, he has to proceed towards self-actualization and self-integration. It is little wonder that some persons are unable to build up their selves through this complicated process and become victims of delinquency and crime on the one hand, or of neurosis and psychosis on the other. More than 2000 years ago, Lord Krishna said in the Gita, "Let a man lift himself by himself. Let him not degrade himself, for the self alone is the friend of the self, and the self alone is the enemy of the self." For him who has conquered his lower self by the higher self, his self is a friend, but for him who has not possessed his higher self, his very self will act in enmity like an enemy. Conclusion. Our self-concepts are not always perfectly aligned with reality. Some students might believe that they are great at academics, but their school transcripts might tell a different story. According to Carl Rogers, The degree to which a person's self-concept matches up to reality is known as congruence and incongruence. While we all tend to distort reality to a certain degree, congruence occurs when self-concept is fairly well aligned to reality. Incongruence happens when reality does not match up to our self-concept. Carl Rogers believed that incongruence has its earliest roots in childhood. When parents place conditions on their affection for their children, only expressing love if children earn it through certain behaviors and living up to parents' expectations. Children begin to distort the memories of experiences that leave them feeling unworthy of their parents' love. Unconditional love, on the other hand, helps to foster congruence. Children who experience such love feel no need to continually distort their memories in order to believe that other people will love and accept them as they are.